6 weeks after I buried my husband, I sat in a parking lot in Birmingham and told myself I was only going there for the baby. Danis had called 3 times. She said Sherelle needed her auntie there. I almost didn't go. Something in me, the part that had been quiet and watchful for months, said stay home. I didn't listen to it. I put on a black dress that wasn't quite funeral and wasn't quite celebration, and I drove to that venue anyway. My name is Arlinda Gibson. I am 38 years old. I own 4 supermarkets in this city. And 6 weeks ago, I buried the man who built an empire alongside me for 11 years. I was still learning how to sleep in a quiet house when I walked through that door. The venue was beautiful. Balloon arches, a custom cake, a photographer moving through the room like it was a wedding. Danis met me at the door with both arms open and held me longer than she needed to. She pulled back, looked at my face, and said, I looked strong. I told her thank you. If she meant it, I couldn't tell. I stopped being able to read her clearly sometime in the past year, and I had only recently understood why. There were 12 of us in that room. Mutual friends. A few faces I recognized from church. 2 women I'd seen at Danis's job events. We ate. We sang. Sherelle sat in her high chair in a yellow dress with a bow bigger than her head, unbothered by all of it the way only a 1-year-old can be. 30 minutes in, Danis set down her cup and asked for the room's attention. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. Drop the time in the comments. Morning, afternoon, midnight. Wherever this finds you, let me know. Because what I am about to tell you, I still have days where I can barely believe it happened in real life. She said she had something important to share, something she had been carrying too long alone. Her voice was steady, practiced, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment until the nerves wore smooth. She said Sherelle was Norbert Gibson's daughter. She said she was entitled to half the Gibson estate. Then she reached into her bag and placed a document on the table. A will. Norbert's name on it. Danis Mouton and Sherelle Mouton listed as beneficiaries. She slid it towards me with the calm of a woman who believed she had already won. The room went completely still. Every person in that space turned to look at me, waiting for tears, waiting for rage, waiting for me to come apart at a baby's birthday party 6 weeks after a funeral. I picked up the document. I read it. I set it down. I looked at Denise and I said, okay. She blinked. Just once. She had not prepared for okay. I understood exactly what she had done and exactly why she had done it here. A private letter could be buried. 12 witnesses cannot be unwitnessed. She had calculated that I would spend anything to protect the Gibson name quietly rather than fight her publicly. She had watched me hold that name together through 11 months of illness and a funeral and 6 weeks of grief. She thought she knew my price. She was 2 years too late. On my way out, I passed Sherelle's high chair. I stopped walking. I stood there and looked at that baby in her yellow dress, her hands wrapped around a plastic cup, completely unaware that her mother had just tried to use her as a weapon. I did not touch her. I just looked. Then I walked to my car and called Elston Presswood. He already knew. Someone in that room had posted within the hour. He said, don't worry. I told him I wasn't. I said I'd be in his office Monday morning. He said he'd have coffee ready. I reached for the coffee before I remembered. My hand was already moving toward the cabinet. The same motion. 11 years of muscle memory. And then I stopped. Just stood there in my kitchen on a Sunday morning with my hand in the air and the silence pressing in from every direction. He always made the coffee. Every Sunday, without fail. I never asked him to. He just did it. The way some people show love through grand gestures and others show it through the same quiet act, repeated until it becomes the architecture of your mornings. I did not know how much of my peace lived inside that small routine until I was standing there with nothing in my cup and nowhere to put my hands. I made it myself. It tasted exactly the same. That was almost worse. I want to tell you about the man I married before I tell you anything else about what happened to us. We met at a Birmingham City Council meeting 9 years before the cancer diagnosis, and 12 before any of this. Norbert was presenting a commercial development proposal for a corridor in Ensley. I was opposing it. His footprint would have displaced 3 Black-owned businesses, including the location I was using for my first supermarket. I came with documentation he had not anticipated. Lease agreements, foot traffic data, a signed letter from every affected business owner. He listened to every word I said with the kind of attention that made you feel like the room had gotten smaller. He disagreed with my conclusion, but he respected my evidence. 2 days later, he called. He said it was about the proposal. I knew from his first sentence it was not about the proposal. We were married 14 months after that phone call. The early years were good in the way that real things are good. Not perfect, not painless, but true. We wanted children. That part did not go the way we planned. The first miscarriage came at 11 weeks. I remember his face in that hospital corridor. Not the face of a man searching for something useful to say, but a man who understood that nothing useful existed and chose to stay inside the silence with me anyway. The second came at 14 weeks, the third at 8. After the third, the doctor sat us down. She spoke carefully and kindly and said the words I had been preparing myself to hear. Norbert held both my hands across the table in that exam room. He looked at me and said we were enough. Just the 2 of us was enough. He said it without performance, without rush, like a man who had already done his grieving privately and arrived somewhere solid, so I would have somewhere to land. I did not know until much later how long that had taken him. Danis was present through all of it, every waiting room, every morning after. She was the one who brought food without being asked, who understood when silence was more useful than words, who sat beside me on the nights Norbert didn't know what to do with his own helplessness. I trusted her with the most unguarded seasons of my life. I handed her the parts of me I didn't show anyone else. I believed that was what best friends were for. Last night, after I got home from that birthday party, I found a photograph. The 3 of us, me, Norbert, Danis, from a trip we took years ago. All 3 laughing at something the camera caught before we knew it was coming. Norbert's hand on my shoulder. Denise leaning in like she belonged exactly where she was. I have been studying that photograph for an hour. I think I finally know when the shift happened in her eyes. I think I know the exact moment everything changed. I am not ready to say it yet. The photograph I found last night was taken at our 10th anniversary party. I know the exact moment the camera caught it because I remember what we were laughing at. Something Norbert said right before the flash. Something small and private that would mean nothing to anyone else in that room. That is the kind of thing a decade builds. Language nobody else speaks. I want to take you back to that night because I believe it is where everything that came after was quietly decided. The house was full. We had maybe 40 guests, family, close friends, people who had watched us build from the first supermarket in Ensley to what the business had become by then. Norbert met me at the bottom of the stairs when I came down. He did not say anything. He just looked at me the way he had been looking at me since that city council meeting. Like I was still the most interesting problem he had ever decided to stop arguing with. I remember feeling genuinely happy that night. Not performed happiness, not relieved happiness. The specific kind that belongs to a woman who built something real alongside someone real and knows it in her bones. Sometime around 9 o'clock, I noticed Denise was missing from the room. I found her on the back porch, standing at the railing with a glass she wasn't drinking from, looking out at the yard like something out there had her attention. I stepped outside and asked if she was all right. She turned, smiled, said she was fine, just tired. I put my arm around her, told her she could leave whenever she needed to, and went back inside. I thought nothing of it. Not one thing. I have replayed that porch 100 times since yesterday. What I saw on her face was not tiredness. I know that now with the clarity that only hindsight and betrayal can produce together. At first, I thought it was loneliness. Then, after everything happened, I convinced myself it was Norbert. The truth is, I am not sure either explanation is complete, because a few minutes before I found her outside, she had been standing in my office looking at a framed photograph from the opening day of the Woodlawn store. I remember that now. She asked how many locations we had by then. She asked how many employees worked across all 4 stores. Then she laughed and said she should have chosen a different career path. At the time, it sounded harmless. Most dangerous things do. What I know now is that something in that house had captured her attention. Maybe it was the marriage. Maybe it was the life. Maybe she had stopped separating the two. I understand that feeling. I want to be precise about that. Understanding is not excusing. Longing is real. Envy is human. Standing at the edge of someone else's happiness and aching for your own version of it is not a crime. It is just Tuesday for most people. The question has never been whether you feel it. The question is always what you decide to do with it. Denise made her decision, not that night on the porch, but within the year that followed. What I noticed in the months after that anniversary was a temperature change I could not name at the time. Small comments that arrived dressed as jokes. Quiet comparisons slipped into ordinary conversations. A way of looking at things I had, my stores, my house, my marriage, that carried something underneath the warmth. Something I told myself I was imagining because I loved her, and love has a way of insisting on its own blindness. I was not imagining it. I have thought a great deal about that porch since last night, about what I asked her and what I didn't. I asked her if she was all right. I put my arm around her and went back to my party. I wish I had asked her something different. Not, "Are you all right?" That question only ever gets you the answer someone has already prepared. I wish I had asked her what she wanted. Out of her life, out of her friendships, out of the years still ahead of her. An honest answer to that question that night might have changed the direction of a great many things. But I did not ask it, and she did not offer it. And a year later, the direction was set. The dishes were still on the table. I remember that detail clearly. The plates we hadn't cleared, the glasses with the last inch of water still in them, the ordinary evidence of a meal that had no idea what was about to happen inside the same room. Norbert had been quiet through dinner. Not the quiet of a sick man conserving energy, a different quiet, the kind that has weight and direction. He had been carrying something for 6 months. I had felt it and told myself it was the cancer. The diagnosis had come 2 months earlier, pancreatic, aggressive, the kind of news that restructures every silence in a house. I attributed everything I could not explain to that. I was wrong. He started talking with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it enough times to get all the way through without stopping. He did not circle it. He did not soften the entry. He said there was something I needed to know, and he was going to tell me all of it. The affair was brief. 2.5 years prior. One failure inside 11 years he could not explain in any way that would help either of us and chose not to try. He ended it. He believed it was finished. For a long moment after that, neither of us spoke. The room felt smaller, not because of what he had said, because of everything he had not said yet. I knew there was more. I could see it on his face. The affair itself was not the thing that had been hollowing him out for 6 months. Something had happened afterward. Something he had not expected. When he finally continued, his voice changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to hear the difference. He told me someone from my life had come back into his life carrying information he did not know what to do with. Information that should have stayed buried. Information that had gradually become a problem neither of us could afford to ignore. I asked who. He looked down at the table before he answered. Danis. I wish I could tell you that hearing her name shocked me. It didn't. Not because I suspected her. Because over the previous year there had been moments I could not explain. Small things. A strange comment. An unusual look. Tiny shifts that never lasted long enough for me to grab hold of them. Nothing concrete. Just enough that hearing her name felt less like a lightning strike and more like a lock clicking open somewhere in the distance. Norbert kept talking. He told me Danis had approached him months earlier with something she claimed would change everything. He said she had presented it with complete certainty. He said she seemed convinced that what she possessed gave her power. I asked him if it was true. He said he didn't know. That answer landed harder than anything else he had said. Not because uncertainty is worse than certainty. Because uncertainty leaves room for every possible disaster. I sat completely still through all of it. I want to be honest about what that stillness was. It was not dignity. It was not grace. It was my mind moving at a speed I cannot fully describe, running through every implication, every possibility, every version of what the next 60 seconds could become, depending on what was still waiting for me at the end of his story. I considered leaving. I want you to understand that I sat with that option fully and honestly. I turned it over. I looked at it from every angle. I gave it the weight it deserved. Then I looked at Norbert. There is a difference between a man who fails you and a man who stops caring whether you know. Those are not the same thing, and they do not carry the same consequence. Norbert was sick, and he was terrified. And he had carried this for 6 months past the moment his own mortality made silence unacceptable. He told me when every easier option was still available to him. He chose the harder thing. That told me something about who he still was underneath the failure. I made 3 decisions in that stillness. I was not leaving. I was not collapsing. And Danis Mouton was not going to dictate what happened to my future. I looked at him and asked one question. Did he still have her number? He said yes. I said good. Then I told him exactly what I needed him to do. That was the night my husband stopped carrying the weight alone. And the night I picked it up and turned it into something else entirely. I turned it into architecture. 1 week after Norbert told me everything, the 3 of us sat down at the kitchen table. Elston Presswood had been our attorney for 7 years. He was not a man who used 2 words when one would do. And he did not use 1 word when silence would do better. He came in, set his legal pad on the table, and laid out exactly what we were facing with the efficiency of someone who had seen versions of this before and knew precisely where each version tended to go. He anticipated the paternity claim. He anticipated the estate exposure. The way a pregnancy claim against a man with significant assets creates immediate legal vulnerability if the assets are not properly positioned. He anticipated the forgery attempt. He said he had seen that specific move in cases with similar profiles, and it was almost always the final play of someone who had been building toward a single moment for longer than anyone realized. His recommendations were specific and came in order. We worked through each one without rushing and without sentiment. By the time he left that evening, we had a plan, and the plan had a sequence. The first move belonged to Norbert. He called Danis 3 days later. He told her his attorney had raised questions about the arrangement, and he wanted to get ahead of it before things became complicated. He kept his voice easy, slightly worried. The voice of a man who needed her help managing a problem, rather than a man who had spent a week building a case. He mentioned, in passing, that I was in Huntsville visiting family for the week. She agreed to come to the house the following afternoon. She arrived in a good dress. I noticed that later. Norbert mentioned it, and I filed it away as information about her state of mind. She had dressed for a negotiation she believed she was going to win. She did not know his phone had been recording from the moment she knocked on the door. She did not know I was in the room directly off the kitchen with my back against the wall, and my hand pressed flat against it. Not to steady myself, but because my hands needed somewhere to be that was not visible to anyone. Danis sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Elston had laid out his legal pad 7 days earlier. The same surface where I had sat through 3 losses that remade who I was. The same 4 walls that had held 11 years of ordinary Sundays. She sat in my house, and she laid out her demands with the comfort of a woman who believed the leverage was entirely hers. She wanted a monthly payment, structured, formalized in writing. An amount that had increased considerably from what Norbert had paid her before. She said if it was not formalized, she would go public. She would let Birmingham make its own determination about what kind of man Norbert Gibson really was. She said she had documentation. She did not specify what the documentation was. She did not need to. The implication was the weapon, and she knew how to hold it. Norbert's voice did not change once through any of it. He said he understood. He said he needed a few days to speak with his attorney. He said he appreciated her coming. She left, satisfied. I heard the front door close, and I stood in that room and breathed. Elston had the recording by that evening. He called within the hour of receiving it. He said every word was captured cleanly. He said Alabama only requires one party to consent to a recording, and Norbert's consent was the only consent required. He said the recording was fully admissible. Danis had walked out of my house that afternoon, believing she held everything. She had walked out leaving everything behind. The morning Danis posted that Sherelle had arrived, I was already awake. I saw the announcement before 6 o'clock. A photograph of a baby in a pink blanket, eyes closed, fingers curled, completely new to a world that had no idea what her mother had built around her before she took her first breath. The caption said, "She was perfect." The comments came in fast. I read every one. That afternoon, I ordered a handmade quilt from a woman in Homewood who had made baby quilts for my church family for 30 years. I wrote a card by hand. I told Denise I loved her and I loved that baby, and I was so glad she was here. I meant the second part more than she will ever know. Denise posted the gift the following day. She held the quilt up to the camera and said I was the best friend a woman could have. Her followers agreed. I liked every comment. I want you to understand what that was. It was not weakness. It was not confusion. It was the most disciplined thing I had done in 13 months of disciplined things. Performing warmth for an audience of people who had no idea what was happening underneath it. Because the moment Danis believed I suspected anything, the plan changed, and everything we had built changed with it. 2 weeks after Sherelle was born, Elston arranged for a private DNA investigation through licensed professionals who handled family law matters of this kind. Every step was documented. Every step complied with applicable law. Chain of custody procedures were maintained from collection through testing. I will not detail the method. I will tell you it was handled correctly, legally, and with the kind of precision that meant the result was reliable for the purpose we needed it for. Elston was clear with me from the beginning. A court would eventually order its own test if paternity became a legal matter. This result was not for a court. It was for me. It was so that I would know what I was carrying before anyone asked me to carry it publicly. 3 weeks later, the result came back. I stared at the sealed report for almost 10 minutes before I opened it. That part surprises people when I tell them. Not because I was afraid of paperwork, because I understood that once I knew, I would never be able to unknow it. As long as the envelope remained closed, every possibility still existed. The moment I opened it, one future would disappear forever. I sat alone at my kitchen table. The house was quiet. Norbert was asleep upstairs. The report sat in front of me. I remember touching the edge of the envelope and realizing something I had not fully admitted to myself until that moment. For months, I had been preparing for more than one outcome. I had sat awake in the dark, thinking through possibilities I never expected to spend my life considering. I had asked myself difficult questions. Questions about loyalty. Questions about forgiveness. Questions about children. Questions about responsibility. I had forced myself to answer them honestly. Whatever that report contained, I intended to face it. Eventually, I opened it. I read every page. Then I read them again. And then a third time. Not because the language was complicated, because I wanted to be absolutely certain I understood what I was looking at before I allowed myself to react to it. I gave myself that evening. The whole of it. I sat in the quiet and let every thought arrive in whatever order it wanted. Some brought relief. Some brought sadness. Some brought questions I was not yet prepared to answer. By the time the sun came up the following morning, I had made my decision. I called Elston. I told him the report would remain private. For now. He agreed. The result was placed exactly where it needed to be. Documented, preserved, and available if the day ever came when the truth needed to stand in a courtroom rather than a file cabinet. Then we moved forward. The report did not change what Danis had done. It did not change the recording. It did not change the estate work already in progress, or the will Elston had anticipated she would eventually produce. What it changed was me. Because from that day forward, I was no longer preparing for possibilities. I was preparing for facts. And facts are much easier to build around. I was ready for that moment. I was already ready for everything. 3 weeks after the birthday party, I was walking the floor of my Woodlawn location at 8 in the morning like I do every third Tuesday. I want you to understand what that means. Not the schedule, but the act itself. I built that store from a lease agreement and a belief that the people in Woodlawn deserved somewhere to buy real food without driving 40 minutes. Before Woodlawn, there was Ensley, which was the first one, the one I put everything I had into before I had anything to lose. Then Eastlake, then West End. 4 stores across 4 Birmingham neighborhoods that had been told for decades that certain things were not available to them. I made them available. My floor manager that morning was moving through the dairy section ahead of me, clipboard in hand, calling out inventory numbers I already knew were going to be short because the Tuesday delivery had run late. I knew 3 of the staff members restocking shelves by name, had known 2 of them since before I opened the Eastlake location. I stopped to ask one of them about her mother, who had been in the hospital the week before. She said her mother was home and doing better. I told her I was glad. That is what the Gibson name looks like when it is standing on its own feet. Not a document. Not a figure. People who know they can look me in the eye on a Tuesday morning. My phone buzzed at 8:43. Elston. He said the letter went out that morning. I stepped into my office at the back of the store and closed the door. The letter, he explained, had done three things. It presented the authenticated will, properly executed, signed by two verifiable witnesses, notarized, and filed with Jefferson County Probate Court before Norbert drew his last breath, alongside the documentation establishing every element of its validity. The forged document Danis had produced at the birthday party was not simply invalid. Measured against what had already been filed, it was criminal. The letter then referenced the DNA evidence framework, noting that should any paternity claim proceed, the matter would be subject to formal court-ordered testing. It said nothing further about that. It did not need to say further. The final paragraph noted that additional documentation existed pertaining to direct communications between the deceased and the recipient. That documentation had been preserved in its entirety and was available to relevant authorities upon request. Elston did not use the word recording. He did not describe the nature of the communications. He did not need to. He told me that any attorney reviewing that paragraph would understand precisely what it referenced and precisely what it meant for their client's exposure. Then he mentioned one additional thing. Danis's attorney had called less than an hour after receiving the letter, not to respond, to verify. He wanted confirmation that the probate filing number referenced in the letter was real. It was. He wanted confirmation that the witnesses were identifiable and available. They were. He wanted confirmation that the supporting documentation existed. It did. Elston told me the questions stopped after that. I sat in my office for a moment after he finished. Then I went back out onto the floor and finished my walkthrough. The following morning, Elston called before I had finished my coffee. He said Danis's attorney had contacted his office again. The attorney said his client wished to discuss a resolution, a settlement conversation, the kind of call that gets made when someone has read a letter carefully enough to understand that the ground they were standing on is no longer there. Elston told him there was nothing to discuss. He said the estate claim was fraudulent. The documentation establishing that fact was fully in order, and his client would be in touch regarding next steps. The attorney asked what next steps meant. Elston said he would be in touch. Then he ended the call. In the days between the birthday party and Elston's letter, Danis was not quiet. She posted carefully. Nothing that named me directly, nothing that referenced the estate or the will or any specific claim she could be held to in a legal proceeding, but enough. Posts about truth finding its way to the surface, about what women carry alone for too long, about deserving what you are owed. Birmingham reads between lines the way most cities read headlines, fast, thoroughly, and with complete retention. Her followers understood the subtext. The comments told her they did. She posted 4 times in 3 weeks, and every post landed in our shared social circle like a stone dropped in still water. Then Elston's letter arrived at her attorney's office, and she went completely silent. No posts, no statements, no call to me, no message, no mutual friend deployed as a messenger. 10 days of nothing where there had been careful, calculated something. I noticed the silence the same way you notice when a sound you have been hearing for weeks suddenly stops. The absence had its own texture. I have since pieced together what those 10 days looked like on her side of things, and I want to walk you through it because I think it matters. Her attorney read that letter, and then he sat down with Denise and explained it to her in the way attorneys explain things when the news is not good, methodically, without softening, because softening at that stage only delays the panic rather than preventing it. He would have started with the will. The document she had carried into that birthday party and laid on a table in front of 12 people was not simply a forgery that had failed. It was a felony she had committed publicly. Uttering a forged instrument in Alabama is a criminal offense. She had done it with witnesses present who had already spoken to people who had spoken to other people across a city that remembers everything. There was no version of that document that was not a problem for her now. Then, the recording reference. Any attorney worth the license on his wall reads a paragraph about preserved documentation of direct communications and understands immediately what that means. If that conversation existed on tape, and the letter was telling her attorney that it did, she had handed the other side evidence while believing she was negotiating from strength. Then, the DNA framework. The letter had been clear. Any paternity claim would be subject to formal court-ordered testing. Her attorney would have told her what that meant in plain language. He knew enough about the legal landscape to understand that if Elston Presswood was referencing a DNA framework with that level of confidence, the answer was unlikely to be the one Danis needed. 3 fronts: criminal exposure on one side, civil exposure on another, and uncertainty sitting directly in the middle. Sometime during those 10 days, she made one attempt to regain control. A mutual acquaintance later told me Danis quietly reached out to one of the guests from the birthday party. Not to discuss the estate. Not directly. She simply wanted to know who had spoken afterward and what people were saying. The answer apparently wasn't what she hoped for, because she never contacted a second guest. That detail stayed with me. It was the first sign that she had stopped acting like a woman advancing a claim and started acting like a woman measuring damage. On the 9th day, a mutual friend called me. She asked if everything was all right between me and Danis. Said she had noticed things seemed a little quiet between us and wanted to check in. Her voice carried the particular gentleness of a woman who suspects something but hopes to be wrong. I told her everything was fine. I was managing some estate matters that required my attention. I said I appreciated her calling. She accepted that. I did not correct her assumption that this was the kind of thing that would eventually resolve itself between 2 old friends. I have learned that Birmingham does not need to know everything to know something. The city was already watching. It would see what it needed to see when the time came. Silence from Danis was not peace. I knew that clearly. It was the interval between one kind of trouble and the next, the held breath of a cornered woman deciding which direction to move. I had already bricked over every door I could find, but I stayed watchful. Because a cornered woman does not always surrender. Sometimes she finds a door you missed. I come to the cemetery every Tuesday, not because I was told to, not because grief has a schedule someone handed me. I come because Tuesday was the day he had his standing appointment with Elston in those final months. The day he would come home with his legal pad and his quiet exhaustion and sit at the kitchen table going through whatever needed to be gone through. Tuesday became the day the work happened. Now it is the day I come to tell him what the work is doing. I want to talk about what he chose to do with the time he had left. When Norbert's diagnosis came, it was the kind that does not offer negotiation. Pancreatic, aggressive, the kind of cancer that tells you exactly how much time you have and then takes a little more. What it could not tell him was what to do with that time. That part was his decision. He chose to spend it protecting me. I watched him restructure assets on days when he was too tired to eat a full meal. Sitting at that table with documents in front of him, reading each page with the concentration of a man who understood that his signature on the right line was worth more right now than his comfort. I watched him drive to Elston's office for meetings when his body was doing things I will not describe in detail, because the details of what his body went through in those months belong to him and not to this story. I watched him make that recording with Danis. Sit in our kitchen, keep his voice level, manage the performance of a man who was worried rather than a man who was building a case, while managing chemotherapy side effects that would have put most people in bed for a week. He did not complain once, not to me, not about any of it. What I did not fully understand until the very end was that he was not doing it out of guilt. He had moved past guilt in the months between the confession and the work. He was doing it because he had decided, with whatever clarity a dying man arrives at, that the last thing he would leave in this world was her, meaning me, standing on solid ground. The last Sunday morning, he was too weak to get out of bed. I woke up, and the kitchen was quiet in a way that told me before I reached the coffee maker what I was going to find. I walked to our room. He was lying on his back, looking at the ceiling the way he did when his mind was somewhere he could not quite get to. He turned his head when I came in. He said he was sorry about the coffee. I told him to stop. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he needed to know I was going to be all right. Not as a formality. As a man who needed one true thing to hold before he let go of the rest. I sat on the edge of the bed. I told him we had done everything we could do. The trust, the will, the filing, the recording. Every piece of it where it needed to be. I said it the way he needed to hear it. Not as a guarantee, because neither of us could control what other people would do next, but as a promise that whatever came, I would not be facing it unprepared inside the house we had built together. He said he knew. He said he just needed to hear me say it out loud in this house. I told him I was going to be more than all right. I told him I was going to be exactly what we built together. He closed his eyes. He smiled. I stood at his grave this morning and I told him the work is doing what we built it to do. And then I told him, the thing I come every Tuesday to say, that I keep that last smile in a place no court can reach, no forgery can contest, and no woman who stood on my back porch pretending to be tired will ever be able to touch. Some things Danis Mouton will never be able to hold. That smile is one of them. This morning, I sat at the head of my conference table in the Woodlawn location with my store managers and went through Q3 inventory projections like I do every month. One manager had concerns about the West End receiving schedule. Another needed approval on a staffing adjustment for the Eastlake location. We worked through both in under 40 minutes, and I sent everyone back to their floors. That is what the Gibson Empire looks like on an ordinary Thursday. 4 stores, real work, real people, depending on decisions made at a table in Birmingham. I want to tell you exactly what Danis thought she was walking into. And then I want to tell you what was actually there. The first mistake people make when they hear a number like $150 million is assuming it came from the supermarkets. It did not. The supermarket chain, Ensley, Eastlake, Woodlawn, West End, was built before my marriage. Every dollar of initial capital came from me. Every lease negotiation, every vendor relationship, every staffing decision in those first years was mine. When Norbert and I married, the business was already standing. It went into the marriage as mine, and it remained mine throughout it. Combined brand equity and property value sits at approximately $12 million. That asset was never in play. It was never Norbert's to leave anyone. Norbert's fortune came from commercial real estate. Long before the birthday party, long before the diagnosis, and long before Denise decided she wanted a piece of our lives, Norbert had spent decades acquiring commercial property throughout Jefferson County and Shelby County. Some parcels were purchased during downturns when few people wanted them. Others were acquired through development partnerships that matured over years rather than months. 17 properties ultimately became part of that portfolio: office buildings, mixed-use developments, retail centers, and 2 major projects Norbert completed in the final years of his career. Several sat on land purchased years before surrounding commercial corridors expanded. What began as ordinary acquisitions appreciated dramatically as Birmingham continued to grow around them. Independent valuations completed during the trust restructuring placed the combined real estate portfolio at just over $132 million. That portfolio, along with 3 investment accounts and 2 additional standalone properties, was transferred into the Gibson Family Trust 13 months before Norbert died. I am the sole trustee. Elston handled the transfer with one specific priority beyond the legal mechanics: timing. At the moment every transaction was executed, Danis Mouton had no filed legal claim against Norbert's estate. She had no creditor status of any kind. She was, on paper, a private citizen with no legal relationship to either of us. That timing is not incidental. Elston documented it explicitly in the transfer records because he had anticipated, from the first meeting at our kitchen table, that someone would eventually argue fraudulent transfer. The documentation made that argument unavailable before it could be constructed. The authenticated will was executed 8 months before Norbert's death. 2 witnesses, both Birmingham residents, both verifiable, neither connected to any dispute or interested party. Notarized by a licensed Alabama notary whose credentials are on file. Filed with Jefferson County Probate Court the week Norbert died. Every element of its execution is documented and confirmable. Now let me tell you about the document Danis brought to that birthday party. Elston had it in his office within 48 hours of the party. He identified the forgery before the end of that same week. The notarization date on the document preceded the notary's licensing in Alabama by 11 months, meaning the notary whose stamp appeared on it was not licensed to notarize anything in this state on the date the document claimed. Neither witness signature matched any individual with any verifiable connection to the Gibson household. The document's formatting contained a header inconsistency that Elston traced to a legal will template available publicly on the internet. The kind of template that looks correct to someone who has never seen an executed estate document and looks immediately wrong to someone who has spent 30 years reading them. Elston included that last detail in his written assessment. I asked him later if he had enjoyed writing it. He said he had found it professionally informative. Denise spent 2 years building toward something. She built carefully, patiently, with more calculation than most people would credit her for. She arrived at that birthday party believing she was holding a door open. That door had been bricked over from the inside before she ever raised her hand to knock. She brought a document to a birthday party. I had filed the real one with the probate court months before Norbert drew his last breath. 5 weeks after the birthday party, Elston called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was reviewing vendor contracts at my desk in the Ensley location. He said a man named Cassell Beaumont had contacted his office. He said he had information relevant to the Mouton paternity claim and was requesting a meeting. I set down the contract I was holding. I knew who Cassell Beaumont was. I had met him twice. Once at a cookout Danis hosted 4 summers ago, and once at a mutual friend's birthday dinner the following year. He was the kind of man you remember as pleasant without being able to recall a single specific thing he said. Decent in a way that did not demand attention. Unhurried in a way that Danis had always described as the problem. She said he had no ambition that matched where she was trying to go. She stopped seeing him sometime before she started executing the plan I now understood she had already been building. I had not thought about Cassell Beaumont in years. I told Elston to meet with him and call me after. The call came the following afternoon. Elston laid it out the way he lays everything out, sequentially, without editorializing, letting the facts carry their own weight. The birthday party announcement had traveled through Birmingham the way information travels through this city, fast and through exactly the people it needed to reach. A guest told a friend. That friend told someone they worked with. That person mentioned it to a woman Cassell had been seeing for the past few months. She told him that same evening. He called Danis before he called anyone else. She did not pick up. He called 3 more times over 2 days. She did not pick up once. Then a separate source, Elston did not name them and I did not ask, told Cassell something that reframed everything. Danis had told people, at the time it would have been relevant, that she had lost the baby. She had told Cassell directly. He had grieved that loss quietly, the way private men grieve private things, and moved forward with his life believing a child of his had not survived. His daughter had been alive in Birmingham for 14 months. He had never been told she existed. He had never held her. He had spent nearly 2 years carrying a grief that was manufactured specifically to keep him from asking questions Danis could not afford to answer. Elston finished and waited. I sat with what he had told me for a moment before I responded. Not because I was surprised. I had known Cassell was likely out there somewhere, had known the real father existed, and would eventually surface when money made silence dangerous. I had anticipated his arrival. What I had not fully anticipated was the specific texture of his fury when Elston described it. This was not a man chasing an estate. This was a man who had been robbed of his daughter's first year of life and wanted to know her. I recognized that. I recognized it in a way I did not explain to Elston because it was not his to hold. I have spent years understanding what it means to want a child and not be able to have one. I know the specific weight of that want. I know what it does to a person over time, quietly, in the spaces nobody else can see. Cassell Beaumont had a daughter 14 months old and had never once been given the chance to choose her. I told Elston to let him proceed with establishing his parental rights. I told him the DNA result I held would make that path straightforward once the court ordered its own testing. And the court result would land exactly where mine already had. Elston noted that Cassell's petition would formally destroy the last remaining pillar of Danis's claim. I said I knew that. I said that was not the reason. I said that child deserves a father who is out there looking for her. And I was not going to be the reason she did not get one. 7 weeks after the birthday party, things began moving the way things move when they have been carefully arranged to move in a specific direction. I want to walk you through the 2 weeks that followed because each piece landed in an order that mattered. Elston filed the civil fraud action against Danis in Jefferson County on a Tuesday morning. Will forgery. Fraudulent estate claim. Both counts documented, supported, and filed as public record before noon. By the following morning, Birmingham's legal and business community had seen it. I know this because 3 people whose professional worlds overlap with mine called to ask careful questions using careful language. The kind of language people use when they want information without appearing to want it. I told each of them I had no comment on active legal matters. That was enough. The filing said everything that needed saying. Danis's professional network, which had been watching quietly since the birthday party, began its own recalculation. I did not need to know the specifics of that recalculation to understand what it meant. In Birmingham, a public fraud filing is not a private matter. It is a conversation that happens without you in rooms you are no longer invited into. 3 days later, Cassell's attorney filed the petition to establish paternity and parental rights. The court scheduled a formal DNA test, standard procedure legally required before any custody determination could proceed. I narrate this part with something I can only describe as private knowledge. The court was about to spend several weeks catching up to information that had been sitting quietly in Elston's files for more than a year. Then, something happened I had not expected. Danis posted, not directly about me, not directly about the estate, a carefully worded statement about harassment, about powerful people weaponizing resources against women who spoke uncomfortable truths, about intimidation disguised as legal process. The post stayed online less than 24 hours, but 24 hours was long enough. People asked questions. Then other people started reading the actual court filings. The post disappeared by the next morning. That was the last public move she made. Then the letter arrived. Danis's attorney sent it to Elston on a Thursday. His client was prepared to withdraw all estate claims in their entirety. In exchange, she was asking that the Gibson estate agree not to provide existing evidence to law enforcement or pursue additional action related to the disputed estate claim. No admission of wrongdoing anywhere in the letter. No accounting for the document she had carried into a birthday party. No acknowledgement of the recording, the paternity claim, or the 2 years of demands made against a dying man. Just a number on one side of a scale and a request on the other. Elston forwarded it to me that evening. I read it at my kitchen table. That table has held more of this story than any other surface in my life. Elston's legal pad the week after the confession. The recorder Norbert carried when Danis came to this house believing she was negotiating. The coffee that wasn't made on the last Sunday morning. And now this. A letter from an attorney representing a woman who wanted to purchase distance from consequences using the same currency she had used on everyone she had ever needed something from. I read it twice. I set it down. I called Elston and told him to decline. He asked if I wanted to reconsider. I told him I did not. Danis was not offering peace. She was offering an exit, a transaction structured to protect her from the record, while leaving the record itself unaddressed. It was the same move she had made with Norbert when she took his money and kept her leverage. The same move she had made with Cassell when she manufactured his grief and kept his daughter. She had spent years converting other people's trust into arrangements that served only her. I was done being part of her arrangements. The following morning, Elston formally notified Danis's attorney that the offer had been rejected. Several days later, he assembled the supporting documentation and submitted a criminal referral package to the appropriate authorities for review. Will, forgery, extortion, every document attached, every communication preserved, every allegation supported by the evidence we had spent more than a year collecting. I did not feel triumphant when he told me it had been submitted. I felt something quieter than that and more permanent. There is a difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge belongs to the person delivering it. Accountability belongs to the record. I have never been interested in what belongs to me in this story. I have only ever been interested in what the record reflects. 2 months after the birthday party, I am watching from the life I have returned to. I want to be precise about that. Returned to, not rebuilt. My life did not need rebuilding. It needed defending. The defense is complete. What I have now is the same life I had before Danis walked into that venue in her good dress, with a forged document and a plan 2 years in the making. The difference is that I know now, with a clarity I did not have before, exactly what that life is worth and exactly what it cost to protect it. Here is what has happened to Danis's world in the 8 weeks since the criminal referral package was submitted. Her employer became aware of the civil filings and the allegations attached to them through public record. Danis worked in pharmaceutical sales, a field that requires professional licensing, background review, and the kind of documented integrity that public fraud allegations make immediately complicated. Her employer opened an internal review. Whether that review ultimately affects her position is not something I know. What I do know is that administrative leave began shortly afterward and remained ongoing as of this narration. The public filings had created questions her employer could not simply ignore. Her social circle contracted the way things contract in Birmingham, fast and without announcement. The woman who called me 6 weeks ago to ask if everything was all right between us has now seen the public filings. She has not called again. The guests who were present at the birthday party, who watched Danis stand in a decorated venue and present a forged document as truth, have given statements to Elston's investigator. Their accounts are part of the civil record now. The social media posts about truth and justice and what women deserve have been deleted. Every one of them. The silence, where her public presence used to be, is louder than anything she ever said into it. The court-ordered DNA test came back 10 days ago. Cassell Beaumont is Sherelle's biological father. The probability is conclusive, the same word the private result used 13 months ago, the same answer I had been carrying in a folder in Elston's office since before Sherelle could walk. To everyone in Elston's office, the court result was a formality, a confirmation of what the documentation already reflected. To Cassell, it was the first true thing anyone had given him in 2 years. I thought about that when Elston told me. I thought about what it means to spend 2 years grieving something that was not real, to carry a loss that was manufactured specifically to keep you from asking the right questions. To find out, through a court result on a Tuesday afternoon, that your daughter has been alive and walking and learning words in a city you drive through every day. His parental rights petition has moved to the next stage. The court has initiated a custody evaluation. That part matters, so I want to be careful with it. A custody evaluation is not automatic punishment because a mother lied. That is not how courts work, and it is not how children should be handled. It is a formal process used when parental rights, custody, and a child's best interest have to be sorted through after paternity has been legally established and serious concerns have been placed in the record. Danis's documented history would not decide the matter by itself, but it would be reviewed. Her judgment would be reviewed. The fact that Cassell had been told his child did not survive would be reviewed. The false estate claim, the public presentation of a forged will, and the pattern of deception surrounding Sherelle's identity would all become part of the larger question the court had to answer. Not who deserved punishment. Who could safely and honestly put that child first? The evaluation will take the time it takes. The record will speak for itself. I have not spoken to Danis since the birthday party. I do not plan to. Everything that needed to be said between us has been said through proper channels, by people whose professional obligation is to speak with precision. There is nothing left that requires my voice directly. I want to say something carefully here because I mean it exactly as I say it. I do not hate Danis Mouton. Hatred would require me to keep giving her square footage inside my own mind. Space I have already fully accounted for, measured and reclaimed. She has been calculated, documented, and addressed. What she did is now a matter of public record in Jefferson County. That is where she lives in my life from this point forward. I have other things to build. I intend to build them. The trees along the cemetery road are beginning to change. I noticed it this morning when I pulled in. The edges of things going amber and copper, the way Birmingham does in October, quietly and without announcement, as if the season decided to shift while nobody was watching. I have been coming here every Tuesday for 3 months. I have watched this road go from summer green to something more honest. 3 months after the birthday party, the legal machinery is doing what legal machinery does when it has been properly built. It is moving forward without requiring me to push it. Cassell's petition for parental rights was granted at the preliminary level 2 weeks ago. Supervised visitation has begun while the full custody evaluation proceeds. The process will take the time it takes. The record will continue to speak on its own behalf. I was not present for any of it. I want to be clear about that. What I know about Castle's first supervised visit, I know because he called Elston's office 4 days after it happened. He did not call to discuss strategy or next steps or anything related to the proceedings. He called to say thank you. to tell Elston that the DNA documentation framework his office had built had made Cassell's petition viable and that he understood that had not been Elston's primary purpose and he was grateful for it anyway. Elston mentioned the call to me the following day. He said Cassell had also talked about the visit. He said Sherelle is 15 months old now. He said when he held out his hand, she looked at it for a moment and then grabbed his finger. He said he did not expect that. He said he did not expect a lot of things about that room. A week later, there was a second visit. Elston only mentioned it briefly. Cassell had arrived carrying a small stuffed elephant. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress anyone, just something he thought a little girl might like. According to the visitation supervisor's notes, Sherelle carried it around for most of the visit. That detail stayed with me for reasons I cannot fully explain. Not because of the toy, because it was ordinary. The first visit belonged to shock. The second belonged to parenting. I have been sitting with that image since Elston told me. A man who spent 2 years grieving a child he did not know was alive, sitting in a supervised visitation room in Birmingham, holding out his hand to a 15-month-old girl who had no idea who he was. And her reaching for him anyway, the way small children reach for things, without calculation, without history, without any of the weight the adults in the room were carrying. She just grabbed his finger. I do not know what kind of father Cassell Beaumont will turn out to be. I want to say that honestly. I do not know if the man who showed up in that room driven by fury and grief will become the man who shows up on an ordinary Tuesday with no crisis behind him and no audience watching. That is the real test of a parent, not the dramatic arrival, the unremarkable continuation. I hope he passes it. Sherelle deserves someone who chooses her when there is nothing urgent driving the choosing. She deserves someone who makes the coffee, in whatever form that takes for her. The small, repeated act that says you are here and I am choosing you again today, the same way I chose you yesterday. I told Norbert that this morning. I stood at his grave in the October light and I told him about the finger, and I told him what I hoped for that little girl. Then I told him the thing I have been trying to find language for since this began. The case is effectively over. The criminal referral is with the district attorney. The civil action is proceeding through the courts. The estate is intact. Every property, every account, every store in every neighborhood exactly where we built it to be. Sherelle has a father who came looking for her. That is more than her mother gave her, and more than she had 3 months ago. And I have my life back. Not the same life. I want to be honest about that. The life I have now has a shape that the life before did not. Different in the places where loss changes the outline of things. Norbert is not in it. That absence has a permanent address, but it is mine. Fully and only mine. 6 months after the birthday party, I woke up before the alarm. The house was quiet in the specific way it has been quiet lately, not the hollow quiet of the first weeks, when every room felt like it was waiting for something that was not coming back. This was a different kind of quiet. Settled. The quiet of a house that has processed what happened inside it and made its peace with continuing. I walked to the kitchen in the early light. I reached for the coffee the way I always reach for it. Automatically, the motion built into my body over 11 years of Sunday mornings. My hand stopped at the cabinet. The same hand. The same cabinet. The same pause. But this time what stopped me was not grief. I stood there for a moment trying to identify correctly what it was. It took me longer than I expected. The feeling was quieter than grief, less dramatic, without grief's particular weight. I finally recognized it as readiness, not the absence of missing him, I still miss him in the specific and irreplaceable way you miss someone who knew you before you knew yourself fully. Readiness is something different. It is the decision that continuing is not a betrayal of what you had. It is what grief eventually asks of you when it has finished doing the work it came to do. I made the coffee. I stood at the window with the cup in both hands and looked out at Birmingham waking up. My city. The neighborhoods I built inside, Ensley, Eastlake, Woodlawn, West End. Their doors opening at 7 in the morning, the way they open every morning for the people who have been coming since I unlocked the first one. I looked at what I built, and I recognized it the way you recognize something true. Without sentiment, without performance, without needing anyone else in the room to confirm it. I built something real. I am still here to run it. I thought about Norbert then, not about the cancer, not about the recording or the trust documents or the authenticated will filed in Jefferson County. About the man. About the man who called me 2 days after a city council meeting he should have won, and I had complicated, and said he was calling about the proposal, and could not get through the first sentence without both of us knowing it was not about the proposal. About the man who sat in 3 hospital corridors and never once made his own discomfort the subject of the room, who understood that grief shared is not grief halved, it is grief witnessed, and chose to witness mine instead of presenting his. About the man who sat at a kitchen table with a recorder running on his phone, and a body that was failing him from the inside, and chose accountability over every easier option that was still available to him. He did not have to tell me. He chose to. That choosing cost him something, and he paid it anyway. He was not a perfect man. I never needed him to be perfect. I needed him to be honest when it counted. He was. Late, but he was. I had a husband who loved me imperfectly and protected me completely. I had a best friend who envied me quietly and betrayed me deliberately. I had a life that nearly got taken from me by someone who stood in my own kitchen and cried at my miscarriages. And I am still here, still building, still carrying the life we built together. She simply wanted what I had. I simply said, okay, because what I had was never something she could hold. I finished the coffee. I set the cup in the sink. I picked up my keys.